G'day, and welcome to my review for the one, the only, Space Quest 2, Vohaul's Revenge. Now, the Space Quest series is widely recognised as one of the seminal titles in adventure game history, loved by many and consistently appearing in top 5 lists on forums like what are the funniest adventure games you've ever played, what is the best adventure games of all time, what is the first adventure game you've ever played, stuff like that. And as with any game that is this popular, there is a bit of negativity on it as well, though most adventure game players recognise this series for what I believe it to be, which is just fantastic. I'll be focusing on Space Quest 2, Vohaul's Revenge. The reason for this is that Space Quest 2 is probably the least known of the series, as it was never remade into a VGA release. So it stands alone in all its EGA and text input glory, which while does give the game a fantastic charm for us retro gamers who are alive at the time of its release, it also makes the game much less accessible to modern gamers. Also, it wasn't until very recently that Space Quest 2 was even sold, you couldn't get your hands on it. You can now get Space Quest 2 from GOG, by the way, but there is a long history of Space Quest packs being sold all over the place through time that simply did not include Space Quest 2. Again, most likely because of the archaic look and sound and the inputs and stuff. Publishers just thought no one wanted to play it. Like we would look at the back of the box and see the blocky graphics and put it back on the shelf, which in truth could well have been the case for many people. Still, this makes me feel that this game is a good one to focus on, as I would hazard a guess that it is probably the least played and least known of the entire series. Space Quest 2 sits in an interesting time for adventure games, a time when the first true separations between text adventures and graphical adventures really started to take form. Space Quest 1 and Space Quest 2 are in fact the turning point where adventure games finally shredded their text adventure roots. Before Space Quest 1, graphical adventures were just text adventures that had graphics. What I mean by this is that the graphics themselves had no real effect upon the gameplay. You could theoretically play many of the original graphic adventures with no graphics at all, just by reading the text boxes and entering the text input. Now, King's Quest obviously came in and changed everything with the advent of the third-person perspective, and giving the player a controllable character that could be moved around a visual game world. Still, even so, King's Quest is not that far removed from a text adventure. I mean, the game did introduce a few things like character positional traps, and I say traps as that is all they were. There was no use of character positions to aid in puzzle design. Well, apart from standing visually close to an object or being on the correct side to push it or whatever. I'm not trying to belittle King's Quest here. It is a landmark game and a great achievement to its designers, but the change to third person was so new and so radical that the game itself fails to explore much of what is possible in this new format, leaving it to the next generation of third-person adventure games to build upon its predecessors and add some really startling and completely new gameplay concepts never before seen before that were literally impossible in a text adventure game. Still, it took a while for these new gameplay concepts to really catch on. Space Quest came out in 1986, that's 2 years after King's Quest, and in the meantime, Sierra had produced the marvellous, really fantastic game called The Black Cauldron, as well as King's Quest 2 and 3. Yet, still these games suffered from the same lack of really exploiting this new medium. Even after Space Quest, there were few games that tried new things. It wasn't until 1989 that all the adventure games that were made at Sierra really started to forge into new ground. Even though Space Quest 1 and 2 had made such startling headway. I mean, even today, you can still find games made in 2011 that suffer from the same lack of imagination and utilization of the visual aspects of adventure games. Take, for example, this sweet little game I love called Gold Rush from the Sierra library, and it's made 1 year after Space Quest 2. And for me, it stands as a great example from this traditional time, for it displays both some of the old problems left over from moving to graphics, as well as showing off some of the new but not very inspired ideas introduced by graphics that came in many of the games beforehand. In this scene, for example, you need to find an old coin that has been dropped into a crack in the floor of this gazebo. Now, in Space Quest 2, or a modern game for that matter, there would be some kind of visual clue here. Maybe a twinkling light, which is a standard device still in use right now in 2011 and counting. I mean, we all know what sparkly means. It means go pick it up. Still, at the very least, in this case, you would see the crack in the floor, or you would have a mark to denote that it needs a closer examination. And then upon examining, you would maybe get a close-up screen of the crack itself where you could see the coin or something like that. A device that was actually used in these early games as a way to bypass resolution restrictions, which was limiting the detail of the graphics in these old games. Anyway, as you can see, there is no visual clue of any kind here. The clue to look for the coin is in fact inside the text description when looking at the gazebo, just like a text adventure. To me, this illustrates the transitional phase in gaming, a phase that Space Quest 1 broke out of, and in which Space Quest 2 was the first to have none of these problems. Gold Rush is kind of a transitional fossil between these times in adventure gaming history, and Space Quest 1 is the one that started moving away from it. But in this example, it has almost the exact same problem. You want to pick up this piece of glass, but you have to stand in the right place, but there is no visual clue. In fact, if we see this exact same scene in the VGA remake, you can actually see the evolution of what this turned into. For in this version, you can actually see that the glass now shines visually. Still, we can't downplay Space Quest 1's achievements. I mean, it had the famous acid dripping puzzle, which was basically a timing puzzle, where you had to get through the acid by visually judging if the acid was going to hit you. You also had the crawling around the grate instead of walking over it. You had the dragging the robot probe to explode the monster. These are all visual puzzles, things that could not be done in text adventures. Space Quest 1, actually, it also introduced arcade elements to adventure games. You had the racing sequence and you had the slot machine games. Now, just before I get into this next section, I would like to say that I found it very hard to find something visual to illustrate my words here. So if it gets a little boring visually here, I hope that you do stay around, because I think that the information is actually quite fascinating. You see, adventure games, like anything really, evolves upon the backs of the games that come beforehand. Adventure games themselves are called adventure games in the same way champagne is often used to describe sparkling wine, as in, we take the name of the original version and then use it to describe all the others that came after. Which is to say that the word adventure comes from an actual game from 1970 by a guy called Will Crowther, one of the minds behind what we now call the internet. His original game was called Advent, short for adventure. It was a simple maze-style game based on a real cave system in Kentucky. This application lay about the computer systems at Stanford University and was continually discovered and rebuilt and collectively tinkered with by the various students that came and went after him. In this way, it mutated from a primitive caving simulation to a game as we might know one today. Dan Woods, for example, added a dwarf throwing axes that you had to avoid. Anyway, as time passed, this game became part of the curriculum at Stanford, where students would be required to construct a clone of the application as part of their degree. It wasn't long until Advent was a full-blown dungeon adventure, with elves, magic, puzzles, inventories, the works. Each student trying to add more and outdo their classmates. It became a text adventure game as we know it today. Though this also birthed the RPG and the MUDs, by the way, which is a whole other story. Anyway, it went through many names like Colossal Cave Adventure or BDSD or whatever, but most versions were simply called Adventure. Interestingly, someone you may know of attended Stanford U during this time, and that was Roberta Williams, and she and her husband formed a company called Online Software. later known of course as Sierra Entertainment, and she started to immediately build games that had graphical interfaces on top of the text-based core that she witnessed at Stanford. The first of which to be released even retained the name, as it was called Adventure in Serenia. In fact, the entire tradition of adding quest at the end of their game names was a nod to the birth of the entire genre and a tip of the hat to Granddaddy Advent. For all her games were called blah blah quest, the same as all the students would call their versions of Advent blah blah adventure. Some of Sierra's most famous games are in fact remakes of early text adventures that still retain the adventure tag. Leisure Suit Larry, for example, is an almost shot-for-shot remake of Soft Porn Adventure, an early 1981 Sierra title. Still, Mystery House, The Dark Crystal, and the others from Sierra are a far cry from King's Quest, the first true third-person adventure game made in 1984. Something that's also worthy of note is that there is an Infocom game called Planetfall, and Infocom, as you probably know, is a fantastic company that just made the best text adventures of all time. And they had this game called Planetfall, and it was released in 1983. That was 3 years before Space Quest 1, and it also stars a space janitor. It is also a comedy, a very, very funny comedy at that. It also has an opening sequence escaping a blowing up ship and landing on a planet and then going through stuff on the planet, going to a town. The similarities between Planetfall and Space Quest are very, very hard to ignore. There is a lot of debate among the adventure game community as to whether Planetfall was really ripped off by Space Quest. But for me personally, this entire argument and conversation is kind of mute. I mean, I just do not care. Both games, on their own as individual games, are fantastic and well worth your time to play. The game itself is fantastic, though as games were at the time, it is very short by today's standards and very, very hard. Expect to die a lot. Dying was in fact a feature of Space Quest, and much of the jokes are given during a breaking of the third wall where the writers talk directly to the player after death. The developers have even said in interviews that you can find around the internet that they wanted people to have fun finding strange and new ways to die. They built death into this game as a feature. So while this works in Space Quest 1 and 2 and 3, I guess, by the time games got more and more advanced, this device was becoming painful, completely ruining some games, and is now a pretty hated thing by the average adventure game player. So that aspect might be a bit of a shock to your system when you go back to play this game, so just keep that in mind. Also, the text phraser, well, it's a Sierra text phraser, so expect the normal Sierra style searching for the correct way to say it problems. Though I think these small annoyances will do little to discolour your experience of this game. You play Roger Wilco, whom previously in Space Quest 1 had foiled the dastardly plot of Vohaul's typical maniacal bad guy rule the universe plot. Though, after all the fanfare and parades and once the fame died down a bit, Roger was still just Roger, the highest ranked janitor on a space station. The only janitor. Little did you know that Vohaul is plotting his revenge and has organised to kidnap you as a way of making sure you cannot interfere with his new plans. So, of course, once you're alerted to his really crazy plan this time, in this manner, it is up to you to once again escape and save the galaxy. All the Space Quest games are worth your times, and this one is my personal favourite. It is dripping with history. It's hilarious, it really is. It is challenging and very hard, and for me, it's very nostalgic, being one of the first EGA games I ever played. I strongly recommend this to everyone that likes adventure games. And if you're a Space Quest fan and haven't played this due to it not being on Steam or not having a VGA remake or whatever, well, you're not really a Space Quest fan. Get your virtual reader GOG and snap this up. Though, if you wait, there are a number of homebrew projects that are vying for first place for the homebrew fan-made remake. And I assume these will be very good, if they ever get made. But like the Heroes and King's Quest games before them, I'll just stick to the originals. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.